Hello everybody, I'm Miss Lisa. Welcome back to another episode of ARTREE Goes Almost Live. We are starting our kids' watercolor classes today. They will be running on Wednesday mornings. The videos premiere at 11 o'clock. If you can't catch the video at that time, no worries. They will be available on our YouTube channel for quite a while. So just tune in when you can. This first class for watercolors is going to be looking at different ways that we can use watercolor paint. It moves in ways that perhaps you hadn't thought about before, and so I just want to show you some of those things so that you'll be better able to use watercolor paint to do what you want to do. We're going to be doing I'm going to show you how to make a painting of the rainbow fish. This is taken from the book by Marcus Pfister, The Rainbow Fish. You may have read it or had it read to you when you were younger. It's a wonderful book and the illustrations are really lovely. So I have taken the time to think about how perhaps Marcus Pfister had done those illustrations. I think he made the illustrations himself, and I'm sure they're watercolor. They just have that look about them. So let's see what we can do. We're going to start with a drawing, and I will show you how to draw this fish or something very similar to this fish. It does not have to look like my fish. My fish does not look exactly like Marcus Pfister's fish. We're going to start with a border. I like to do a border around any piece of paper that's going to have a painting on it because that way we can keep the paint inside the border and not all over the table. And it's also a nice way to make a white frame that goes around your artwork. And you can see that in this piece here. It has a lovely white frame. And so the way we make a border is we're going to draw a big rectangle around our piece of paper. And the easiest way to do this is to make 4 dots, 1 in each corner. And the reason that we put the dots there is because you're going to be joining the dots to make the rectangle, and it's easier to have something to aim for when you're drawing these lines. We're going to be drawing 1, 2, 3, 4 straight lines, and they're going to make a lovely rectangle border for your painting. Now when I draw straight lines, I like to turn my paper slightly. It's easier for me to draw a straight line on the diagonal, but you can do yours any way that's easier for you. I'm just going to go ahead and start my border, and you can go ahead and start yours too. You do not need a ruler, and don't worry if your lines aren't perfectly straight or if you haven't hit the dots with your pencil. Those dots are only there for guides. You don't actually need to connect the dots, but the end result will be a nice big rectangle around your paper. Okay, so I've completed my border, and now I'm going to think about the placement of the fish. I don't want my fish way up here, and I don't want it to be too small, and I don't want it way down here either. I want it somewhere about here, and so just to help me a little bit, I'm going to draw a very faint guideline, a vertical line that's about halfway from one side of the paper to the other. And I'm going to draw a horizontal line that is about halfway from the top of the paper to the bottom. And now I'm going to be thinking about putting my fish in this area here. And you can see from this one that I've actually divided. So here's half of the paper here, and then I've divided that distance again in a half, and you can see that's where I placed the body of the fish. So let's do that now. I've got here, if I draw, let me draw this line darker because I know you won't be able to see it on the camera. So I've got one horizontal line there, and I've got my vertical line here. And I'm going to cut this distance here in half again with another horizontal line. And I'm going to put my fish right about in here. And I'm thinking about an oval shape. So I'm going to think a curved line up, curved line down. Okay, there's an oval shape. And I'm going to put the mouth on this end. I'm just going to take this. When I come down halfway down this curve, I'm going to curve inwards and out. And then on the other end, I'm going to put the tail. Now the tail shape is pretty much a triangle, right? So we can think about a triangle here. And if you wanted to get a little bit fancy, you can. So here's the triangle shape that's overlapping my oval shape. If you wanted to get fancy, you could curve this line up and bring it down like this. And then it's going to attach to the fish here. And then where the mouth comes in, I'm going to make a pair of lips. The rainbow fish has these great lips. And I'm going to place an eye about here. And I'm going to put some fins. Now the fins are pretty much triangle shapes. They're a little bit, perhaps a little bit fancier than triangles, but I'm just going to put a triangle here. And down here there are two fins, which are also like triangles. Maybe they're slightly curved. There's the second one. There's the first. And it's got a little fin in the back here. And now I'm just going to go ahead and use a darker line to bring this all together. So I'm going to go along, try to find an outline of the whole fish. As I come down here and go around my oval shape, I'm going to come down and I'm going to do those lips. And this maybe is, make it a little bit smaller. This comes down. We're going to have a fin and a fin. And we're going to have this little fin in the back. And then the tail shape. Okay, so I've gone around the outline of this fish shape. And I'm going to now erase my little guidelines, because once you paint over them, they're hard to get rid of. And I'm also going to take out these guidelines. And now I'm going to show you how to make scales. So I'm going to add another guideline. Now I'm going to put this guideline here. I'm going to turn my paper this way, and I'm going to make a bumpy line. I'm going to bump right along that line. Bump, 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 bump. Now the second layer of scales is going to start in the middle of the first bump, and it's going to go to the middle of the second bump. And we're going to go to the middle of this one, to the middle of this one, to the middle of this one, and to the middle of the end one. And then we're going to start another layer that starts at the middle of this one, goes up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down, maybe a little bit there. And this one's going to start in the middle of this one, go up and down. I remember when I was a kid, I remember the time I realized how this worked. But, oh, that's pretty cool. Suddenly I could figure out how to make fish scales. Kind of like the first time you tie your shoes and you're thinking, oh wow, after all of that practice, it's actually not so difficult. After all, I spent so long trying to figure that out. Okay, so here we have our fish with scales and fins and an eye and a mouth. And I'm going to erase this guideline now. I don't want that one. And I'm just going to add a few lines here because fins are actually kind of, they have little spines in them. So I'm just going to indicate some of those. And the tail too. And there's our fish. And we're going to put some seaweed down here for the fish to be swimming in. Take those lines out again. And drawing seaweed is kind of fun because it's a wavy line, right? I don't know if you've ever swam in the ocean, but if you have, you know that with the waves pushing you back and forth, the seaweed, if you're swimming anywhere that has seaweed or plants growing in the water, you can see them moving back and forth. And we can indicate that movement with the wavy line. And then the second wavy line, I'm just going to let it move over the first wavy line kind of randomly. And it kind of looks like that whole piece of seaweed is just moving with the waves. Maybe I'll put some rocks down here. So this nice wavy line. And then let's put some other kinds of plants down here. Maybe something that has little oval leaves. Just kind of randomly putting leaves on this plant here. So again, it's kind of waving in the water current. It's not going to be standing straight up from the bottom of from the sandy bit. It's going to be waving in the waves, in the current. Put one behind here. And maybe put one over here because we'll have to mix them up just a little bit. a little piece of the long seaweed here. Okay, so here's our drawing, and this is what we're going to paint in just a minute. Okay, so I actually want to talk to you now about the paints. For those of you that have had me as a teacher before, you know that I love to use these Crayola 8-pan paints. These are called pans that have the dried up paint in them. And we have to resuspend the pigment. The pigment is the part of the paint that gives it color. We resuspend the pigment with water before we start painting. We can also buy watercolor paints in tubes. Here's a couple examples of my artist paints. And if you buy them in tubes like this, then you need somewhere to put your paints before you start working with them. This is called a palette. It's just something that you can put the paint on, and then you can add water to it to make it less solid. So this isn't actually solid. It's kind of maybe the consistency of toothpaste, but when you put more water into it, you'll be able to use it very much like the resuspended Crayola paints. Now the paints are important. The paintbrush is also important. You want to have a good paintbrush for watercolors. The Crayola paintbrush, the one that comes with the paint sets, has been an excellent paintbrush. I noticed in the very recent paint boxes that I've purchased that they have switched to a cheaper paintbrush, and hopefully, I haven't used it yet, but hopefully it works fairly similar to the one before. I loved the paintbrush that used to be in the Crayola paints. Those were excellent brushes for teaching. So this is one of my artist brushes. I love this brush, and a good paintbrush will hold a lot of paint. So it's got a soft, it's called the belly, the part where the paintbrush comes out. It's shaped like this, sort of, and the bristles in that area are able to hold a lot of water and paint, so that when you paint, you don't have to keep going back into your paint and back onto your paper, back into your paint, back onto your paper. You can just go over your paper with the same bunch of paint, and you can work pretty quickly. So in watercolor painting, sometimes you want to work fast, and I'll show you why. Sometimes you might want to work slower, and you can actually use less water in your paint. Let me just show you an example of that. So when you work slower, you can have more control over what you're doing. So if I take a little bit of blue paint and I work slowly, I can put that paint just where I want it. Because I don't have a lot of water in the paint, so it pretty much goes where I want it to. And you can see that I can make these very intricate patterns. And when people think of watercolor painting, they're usually thinking about not having a lot of water in their paints so that they can do things like this. But look what happens if you have a lot of water in your paints. You're able to do this. And you can paint very quickly, and you can cover a lot of ground. Now the paper is actually pretty important, because if you have watercolor paper, if you have paper that is designed to either be a watercolor paper or a mixed media paper, the paint won't soak into the paper quite so quickly as if it was a drawing paper. And that allows you to be able to blend the colors on the paper. You can see what I'm doing here. I've got some green and I've got some blue, and if I put them next to each other, I can actually encourage them to mix by putting in more water, and I can get my sort of turquoise color in between. So if you have a paper that's designed to be either a watercolor paper or a multimedia paper, then you can do some really fun things. Now I have got paper that is a multimedia paper, and so that gives me the freedom to put color down quickly and sort of get some blending of colors on my paper, because maybe I don't want the whole background to be one color of blue. Maybe I'll put a little bit of green in it, maybe a little bit of purple. The purple might indicate some darker, shadowy places of the ocean, and the green might be places that have some plants in the background, and that way it won't just be blue. Let's see how we do here. We're going to start with the blue, and I'm going to put a lot of blue down. And I'm just going to take more water. I'm going to be able to move it along like this. So more paint. I'm going to go around my fish. I'm going to pick up a little bit of green here. I'm going to mix some green into this. A little bit more blue. Maybe some purple in the shadow areas. The purple I find has to be resuspended a little bit more vigorously. I'm going to be painting sort of in between these shapes that are the seaweed. I'm really trying to keep the paintbrush moving, and I'm trying to keep the paint moving too. So we have a fin there. I want to come around the fin and around the seaweed. Now if you find that your paints are still kind of dry, go ahead and take the time to get them wet. You'll find it's much easier to paint if your paint moves and isn't sticky. You'll be able to pick up a lot of color very quickly. Look at that. I can just move that color along like that. Of course, when your brush is this wet, you have to be careful not to fling the paint. You have to be careful of that. But you'll find that you'll be able to move the color very quickly. And this is one thing about watercolor that's really nice, is being able to move the color. If you use oil if you use oil paints or acrylic paints, the paints are heavier, so you don't quite get this degree of freedom. It's a whole different feeling. Not that it's a bad feeling, it's just different. Watercolors are very easy to move. I'm just going to put some green behind some of these plants, like maybe there's more in the background. I'm going to pick up some blue. Okay, now I'm going to go into the green. I'm going to put some green in these seaweed. And I'm going to leave just a little bit of white showing, like I did here. And that just kind of helps you to see the seaweed. This is one way to keep your colors from mixing too much, because the paper's starting to dry out in between now. So if we take advantage of the drier paper and the little bit of white from more dry paper, the colors won't mix as easily. So the blue and the green aren't mixing freely at the moment because the blue has dried halfway and the green is still wet, but it's not moving the same way as if the blue was soaking wet and the green was soaking wet. Now over here, if I put green on these plants, we're not going to be able to see them very well because of the green in the background. So I'm going to use a little bit of yellow on these. And you can see that I didn't erase these pencil lines because I wanted the leaves to be able to show. And that's what happens, how it will show through the watercolor paints, how pencil will show through the watercolor paints. And I don't mind that here, but I might not want the guidelines when I placed my fish to be showing. So I erased those. Okay. Maybe I'll put a little bit of sandy color down here. And our background is pretty much done. So we'll come back in just a minute and work on the fish. Okay, for the fish part, I'm going to be using a black felt tip marker to give my fish just a little bit of definition. I don't know if you've ever tried to paint eyes with watercolor paint, but it can be frustrating. So I'm just going to outline the eye with black. It's hard to get the detail when you're trying to do a quick painting. It's hard to get the detail that are required to make an eye without everything kind of running into each other. So we'll just do the eye and the mouth with pen. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a darker color. Here I use the purple. And I said that the purple is kind of harder to resuspend. So I'm going to work at it just a bit. And now I'm going to draw a line. And I'm going to wet the line. Now, because I'm putting water on the inside of the line, it's going to pull the pigment towards the center of the fish, towards the wet part of the paper. Now, if I add a little bit more purple along that line, we can see that becoming more pronounced. And likewise, if I do the fin. Now, when I do this part of the fish, I'm actually using much less water in my paints. And I'm painting slowly. We could say that this is a more controlled way to paint because I'm working slowly and I'm getting the paint where I want it. Instead of blending all the colors, I'm trying to put certain colors in certain places. I'm going to add just a little bit of this lovely color here. Now, do you see how easily it travels? Because that paper is already wet. But if I use the same color down here, it's not going to go on nearly as easily because the paper's dry. I'm going to outline some of these scales. You can see I used purple on that fish. I'm going to try it in green this time. So my brush is fairly dry and I'm painting slowly. It looks much more controlled than when I was painting the background and going quickly. And the paper was wet and the colors were blending. And I want to go a little bit fast because I want to take advantage of these being damp still. If it dries completely, I won't get any blending at all. But what I want to do now, because I know these are still wet, is I can put a little bit of water in some of these and it'll pull the green paint from the edges into the center of the scale. So I've got some green scales. And I can also blend the colors. Maybe I can take a little bit of yellow and make some of these yellow. And I would expect some of the green on the edges there to blend in with the yellow. If the green hasn't dried completely while I've been talking. Let's try putting a little bit of blue in some of those. I've got another fin back there. I think I'll make that one purple. And because I waited long enough, the red and the purple are not mixing, although they're next to each other. They've had a chance to dry. The red's had a chance to dry, and so the purple and the red are not able to mix. I'm also going to make this back fin purple. Let's make the tail red. I like this red, it's nice and bright. Maybe I'll add some red to some of these scales too. I really like this red. Really brightened up the fish. I think I'm going to make the lips orange. And I waited quite a while because I knew that if the paper was wet around the lips, that the orange would get pulled into the purple, the blue, and the green. And those colors might also end up mixing in with the orange, which is what happened on this fish. You can see that when I put the orange down, the blue wasn't as dry as I hoped it was, and some of the orange was pulled into the blue. Okay, in this case, the lips are pretty orange. They've dried enough. Okay, so there we go, a rainbow fish. I hope you enjoyed that. Let me just quickly explain or remind you what we did. We learned how to draw the fish. We also learned that there are different ways that the water and the paint interact. And so if you have a lot of water in your paints and you use the paints quickly, you're able to move the color across the paper relatively easily, if somewhat messily. So it is a messier way to paint. You can see I've got splashes of blue here and there, but we can get a lot of blending because when the paper is wet, it allows the paints to mingle and interact. So we can see that some of the green is mixing with the blue here. We can see some of the blue is mixing with the purple here. And that gives it a nice sort of an interesting look to it. When we want to be more careful about what's mixing, with something else. We have to paint slower and with less water. When our paints are not so drippy, we're able to go slowly and get the colors where we want. If we do not want the colors to mix, we have to make sure that the colors that are around that area have dried well, dried enough so that the water won't be able to interact with the color that you just put down and pull some of that color to a place that you don't want it. So when you want to put the color exactly where you want and you don't want it to mix with anything else, make sure that the paper around the color is dry as possible. So even if you put other colors down, make sure that that area dries before you add another color next to it. And if you don't want to wait, here's another thing you can do. You can leave just a teeny tiny area of white paper showing. So if I don't want my red and my green to mix, let's say I'm putting my red here, but I don't want it to mix with the green, I can leave a teeny tiny little bit of white paper showing in between. And because that paper, the white paper, is dry, there won't be any pulling of the colors to mix. Now look what happened. Right at that point, I actually touched the red with my wet paintbrush, and that made a little water bridge, and now some of the red is going to mix in with the green. And that's kind of cool. You can get some interesting effects by making little water bridges here and there. But in general, if you can have a nice white area, tiny little white area in between two colors, then that prevents any mixing whatsoever. So I hope you enjoyed this class. I hope you enjoy making a rainbow fish. There are a couple of them now. And stay inside, enjoy your art, and until next time, stay safe. Goodbye.